The trouble began on a bright Saturday morning, the kind of morning that should have been peaceful. Birds were chirping, the smell of freshly cut grass drifted through the neighborhood, and I was sipping my coffee on the back deck, admiring the yard I had poured years of work into. My backyard wasn't just land, it was the heart of my home. A tall privacy fence wrapped around the property, enclosing the vegetable garden I built by hand, the play area where my nieces and nephews spent their summers, and the small workshop where I fixed up old tools. Every inch of that yard carried memories and sweat equity. That's why the piece of paper nailed to my fence stopped me cold. A crisp, official-looking notice with the HOA letterhead flapped in the breeze. The wording was polite but firm. The section of my backyard extending 20 feet beyond the main easement was erroneously enclosed, and would now be reclaimed as community green space. The notice gave me 30 days to remove the fence and restore the land to common use. It ended with a warning: failure to comply would result in fines and possible legal action. I stood there staring at it, at first stunned, then angry. This wasn't some shared patch of grass. This was my property, fenced and maintained for years without a single word of complaint. I had bought this house specifically because of the yard size, and the thought of strangers tearing down what I built was unthinkable. The HOA wasn't asking. They were demanding. Over the next week, the situation escalated. More notices appeared, taped to my door, slipped into my mailbox, even left on my car windshield. Each one grew more aggressive, citing obscure bylaws and vague references to easement rights. Neighbors began whispering that my yard was too big, and that it wasn't fair I had more space than others. Behind closed blinds, I saw members of the HOA board pointing at my fence, measuring tape in hand, as if they already owned the place. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It felt like an attack on me personally, on my right to live peacefully in the home I paid for. Still, I knew better than to fight them with raw emotion. The HOA thrived on intimidation and fear. If I wanted to win, I had to be smarter. So I began quietly documenting everything. I photographed the notices, recorded the dates, and wrote down the names of every board member who set foot near my yard. At night, I sat with a stack of old paperwork, my property deed, and plat maps I hadn't looked at since the day I closed on the house. Something about the HOA's wording nagged at me. They were confident, maybe too confident. And as I traced the boundaries on the survey lines, I realized there was more to this story than they wanted me to believe. The fight was only just beginning. The moment I unfolded the plat survey from the dusty folder in my filing cabinet, I knew I was onto something. The yellowed paper showed the original boundary lines of my lot, drawn decades ago when the neighborhood was first carved out of farmland. Bold black lines outlined my property, and there it was in plain ink. The very section of yard the HOA claimed as community space was marked, numbered, and deeded directly to me. It wasn't just included, it was highlighted as part of my parcel. The more I compared their notices to my records, the angrier I became. They were either careless or deliberately deceptive. The HOA board assumed I would panic, fold under pressure, and tear down my fence to avoid confrontation. But they hadn't counted on me having proof. Proof in the form of stamped legal documents signed at closing and recorded with the county. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to defend my yard. I was going to expose them. My first stop was the county assessor's office. Rows of filing cabinets and digital archives held decades of property transfers and surveys. With the help of a clerk, I located the subdivision's master plan and easement records. Hours passed as I pored over the fine print. What I discovered was shocking. The HOA had no legal claim to my backyard, or any other homeowner's private yard, for that matter. Their jurisdiction ended at the sidewalks, common parks, and shared amenities. Private fenced property was explicitly excluded. But that wasn't all. Buried in the paperwork was a trail of amendments the HOA had tried sneaking into the bylaws over the years. One amendment in particular stood out, a vague clause inserted 3 years ago that referenced reallocation of community land if improperly designated. It was poorly worded and never officially filed with the county. In other words, it had no legal weight. Yet this was the clause they used to justify their campaign against me. I realized the board had overplayed their hand. They were banking on no one checking the original records, hoping to bluff their way into seizing extra land for their pet projects. Maybe it was for a new walking trail, maybe to boost property values for themselves. Whatever the motive, they didn't expect resistance. Armed with copies of the deed, survey maps, and the HOA's sloppy bylaw amendment, I built my case like an engineer reinforcing a bridge. Every document was a beam, every stamped signature a bolt. I made multiple copies, stored digital backups, and prepared a folder that I could drop on any lawyer's desk if it came to that. Meanwhile, the HOA doubled down. They sent me a final compliance warning, this time with threats of daily fines. Neighbors told me a special meeting was scheduled to discuss enforcement actions against me. Their arrogance was astounding. But I wasn't worried anymore. I had the truth on my side, and soon everyone would see just how reckless the board had been. The day of the meeting arrived, and I walked into the room carrying a thick binder of documents. What happened next would change the course of the neighborhood, and cost the HOA far more than they ever imagined. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a space that usually hosted potlucks and book clubs. That night, though, the air was heavy with tension. Folding chairs lined the room, filled with curious neighbors who had heard whispers about my land dispute. At the front sat the HOA board, a row of polished faces hiding behind clipboards and binders, pretending authority they didn't truly have. The president of the board opened with rehearsed confidence, announcing to the crowd that my backyard was improperly fenced and encroached upon community space. They painted me as selfish, someone hoarding land that belonged to everyone. The murmurs in the crowd grew uneasy, some siding with them, others unsure. That was their strategy, shame me into compliance. But when they finished, I stood and calmly placed my binder on the table. Page by page, I laid out the truth. First, the official property deed, stamped and signed by the county. Next, the original survey plat, showing the disputed section firmly within my lot lines. Then, the master plan documents, which clearly excluded private yards from HOA control. Finally, I revealed their own botched amendment, an unenforceable clause never filed with the county, proof that they had been bluffing from the start. As I spoke, the mood in the room shifted. Neighbors leaned forward, eyes widening as they saw the black and white evidence. The board members grew pale, their once confident expressions cracking. By the time I finished, the silence in the room was deafening. Everyone now knew the HOA had not only overreached but had done so with reckless disregard for the law. But I wasn't done. I calmly announced that I had already shared copies of the documents with a property attorney, who confirmed my legal standing. If the board attempted further harassment, they wouldn't just lose in court, they would be liable for damages and legal fees. On top of that, I mentioned the possibility of filing a complaint with the state for mismanagement and abuse of power, something that could strip the board of its authority entirely. The president tried to save face, fumbling through excuses about misinterpretations and clerical errors, but no one was buying it. Neighbors who had once doubted me now glared at the board with suspicion. Some even demanded an apology on the spot. The tide had turned. Within weeks, the board was forced to back off completely. Not only did they rescind all notices against me, but they also had to pay thousands in legal consultation fees when other homeowners began questioning their own fines and disputes. The attempted land grab had backfired spectacularly, exposing their incompetence and draining their budget. Elections soon followed, and several board members quietly resigned, their reputations in ruins. As for me, my backyard remained exactly as it was, fenced, private, and mine. But it became more than just a yard. It was a symbol of standing up against intimidation, of refusing to bow to bullies who thrived on fear. Every time I walked out the back door and saw the fence still standing, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The HOA thought they could take what was mine. Instead, they ended up losing far more than they ever bargained for. And that, as they say, was their big mistake.